Hey everyone, I just played Alisa, and it was the most authentic retro survival horror game I've ever experienced. It feels like a game that fell right out of the late 1990s with all the good and bad connotations that statement suggests. It's a game that oozes atmosphere and charm from its opening moments to the end credits, like a wild cross between Resident Evil and American McGee's Alice. Alisa wears its love for the classics on its sleeve, but it's not afraid to be ambitious and experimental either. Not everything sticks the landing. Boy, do some parts not stick the landing. But for a title developed primarily by one person, this is an absolute achievement. So let's talk about it. But before I get my hands into the gears of this game, if you enjoy the video, please like, subscribe, hit that dumb little bell, comment, share the video around, and go check out my other game reviews. I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, let's get to it. Alisa's setup is simple enough. Alisa is a soldier of the Empire, and an enemy spy has stolen some top-secret blueprints. Soldiers are spreading out along the train line the spy used to escape, but it's Alisa and Jean-Francois who find him running through the woods beside this sleepy town. Alisa chases him to this weird gazebo-looking thing in a sinkhole, but instead of the spy, she finds something else waiting for her. Later, Alisa wakes up in a mysterious bed, and off we go. It's a good hook that introduces a lot of mysteries surrounding the game's plot, but I'll save the discussion on story for later. Right now, the only thing on Alisa's mind is escape. The dollhouse in which Alisa finds herself trapped is like its namesake writ large, a sprawling labyrinth with a layout that no real building would have, but within its own weird nightmare logic sort of makes sense. There's already something inherently creepy about the place, but delve a little deeper and you start to realise there is something seriously wrong with it. The clockwork monstrosities that wander the halls, and the claustrophobic camera angles make you feel tiny too, like you've been shrunk down to the size of a toy for the amusement of something just out of sight. That you get to briefly play as Alisa in her profession as a soldier of the Empire before she is abducted and stripped of not only her weapons but her uniform only adds to the sense of helplessness. It takes a lot to scare me anymore, but I remember how I felt as a wee bab of 12 playing the original Resident Evil for the first time, back when even just wandering the halls beneath the sinister strings of the MIDI orchestra could freak me out enough to make me want to stop playing. I've gone through a lot of horror games since then, and Alisa is one of the very few to get my hackles up in the same sort of way. Alisa gets what made those original survival horror games scary. In fact, you feel Casper Croes' love for the classics shining through every facet of this title. The idiosyncratic keys, the portrait in the pause menu, the retro crunchiness of the graphics, even just the aspect ratio, and especially the dialogue.
I was almost a sandwich.
This is what I mean when I say it's authentic to the style of classic survival horror. Even when the game breaks established rules, it does so without ruining the tone or atmosphere. One of the most impressive moments in the game for me was this very brief section where you crawl through some machinery. Thanks to the wonders of modern technology and the Unity engine, this could have very easily been a 3D model, but Casper Croes took the time to make the 2D background move the same way it would have back in the late 1990s. That attention to detail extends to the character models too. There's a lot of enemy variety based on several different themes, but none of them feel out of place, even when encountered outside of their original environment. The sound design does a lot to draw each of the game's disparate elements together too. The bleeps and bloops of the menus, the echoing footsteps on a marble floor, the resonant boom of a shotgun blast, the squeaky footsteps of an incoming clown, or the creepy giggles of an approaching doll, the ominous drone whenever she shows up. All the keys and puzzles sound so crisp and clean, you can hear the turning of each individual tumbler inside the locks. The soundtrack only adds to the atmosphere, both when it's acting as an obvious homage to the classics, and when it's off doing its own thing. Just listen. And all of this without even getting into the world building. In fact, you know what? It feels like this entire game was laser focused to appeal to me in terms of presentation. I don't have a bad thing to say about it. The gameplay, on the other hand, oh dear. Alisa's gameplay is just as authentic to the survival horror classics of the late 90s, albeit in a slightly different way. There are 3 sides to it: exploration, puzzles, combat. Okay, look, the early game can be absolute hell, especially on your first run before you get your bearings. So here's a few tips. You can rebind all the controls, and you should, so that you're not mashing left control every time you want to interact with anything or use a weapon. The game's puzzles are generally pretty well explained and telegraphed. There's only one that really feels obtuse for no good reason, and it's this puzzle here. There's a locked cabinet covered in painted sheep. Here is a room also covered with painted sheep, and a note nearby telling you to count them. This seems like it should be simple, but what makes it obtuse is that these hints are actually for 2 separate puzzles, both of which you can't even complete until you defeat the area's boss. The sheep on the wall have nothing to do with the code needed to unlock the cabinet. Do not believe their lies. Also, when you finally do get the code for the cabinet, the numbers may not be in the order you received them. It's not a bug, the puzzle is just like that. But it also means if you're unlucky enough to get 4 separate numbers from the clock, that's 24 combinations to try. Good luck. The code for the cabinet is also randomized. A few of the puzzle solutions are, which is a cool addition to the formula, but they're not just randomized for every playthrough, they're randomized for every loaded save. So if you find the solution, note it down, die or quit, and come back later, the numbers you have just won't work anymore. You're going to have to go out and find the answer again. Otherwise, the most trouble a new player will probably have is with the game's combat. On the standard difficulty, there's no auto-aim. Instead, you only know you're successfully targeting an enemy when this reticule in the corner lights up. Oh god, no, not again, no please, I killed you, you're supposed to be dead! Okay, it's not that bad. You may not have auto-aim, but the targeting system is pretty generous, and you can stun-lock enemies without too much trouble, especially with melee weapons. If you ever have trouble trying to hit a fast-moving enemy, just remember that stairs are your friends. During the prologue you might notice a saber on Alisa's hip. Once you're dragged into the dollhouse, you're going to want to get that back as soon as possible. Study the blade because it is an absolute workhorse of a weapon. It saves you ammo, allows you to hit spindly enemies on the ground, and it has a surprising amount of range and damage too. You can find it—
Hey, you!
One of the things that does differentiate this game from its influences is the presence of a shop system. Dead enemies drop tooth wheels, which you can trade with Pole here for weapons, dresses, and items. You can buy the saber from Pole from the second you find him, and also this blunderbuss. Do not buy this blunderbuss. It is a trap for first-time players who want the extra protection of a shotgun. It holds 1 shell, its reload times are insane, even wearing the soldier's uniform which buffs reloading, and enemies are so fast that you'll probably have trouble hitting anything with it anyway. A far better alternative becomes available to you later in the game. For now, save your tooth wheels and learn to love the saber. Something else to take note of is how stingy this game is with health and ammo. You can find pickups scattered around the dollhouse, but they are rare, out of the way, and they can be hidden behind multiple interactions with the same wardrobe or cabinet. Most of your supplies will come from Pole's shop, but unfortunately for Alisa, he's a greedy little shit who deserves nothing but death. Even basic supplies can cost more tooth wheels than what common enemies will drop. And just to add insult to injury, Pole takes a sales tax on saving your game too. This is why getting the saber early on is so important. You get the same amount of tooth wheels without wasting any of the ammo you do happen to find. It's not effective against every enemy, but for the vast majority of the game, it's the only weapon you'll really need. Don't let enemies get too close though, because they can and will stun lock you if they're fast enough. The clowns are really bad for this. Most of the time the best play is usually to avoid them. There are a lot of mini-bosses disguised as regular enemies too, who only appear in 1 or 2 locations that are better left ignored until you're strong enough to deal with them anyway, like this guy in the dollhouse's kitchen. Good to see Debilitus getting work again. You could choose the easier difficulty at the start of the game, which gives you auto-aim from the get-go, but but you also get fewer tooth wheels from defeated enemies. Just go full anime, pocket the tooth wheels, and stock up on medkits at the shop. Combat will still be frustrating, but you'll have a much better chance of surviving everything the dollhouse can throw at you until you progress far enough to start buying the more powerful weapons. Equally as important as what you're killing enemies with is that you're looking good while you do it. Alisa has an absurd amount of costumes, and a lot of them actually do help in gameplay. The soldier's uniform increases reload speed, as I've already mentioned. The nurse's outfit increases the amount of health received from every medkit. Even the starting blue dress makes it harder for enemies to notice you, since they think you're one of their own. Some of them get pretty crazy too, like the Hydra suit, which makes you slippery enough to escape enemy grabs with ease, as well as swim through more waterlogged areas of the dollhouse. Some of them are practically weapons in and of themselves, some of them are silly, some of them are quite horny. Not all of them can be bought from Pol, some of them have to be found around the dollhouse, or acquired through other spoilery methods only available on a New Game Plus run. The same is true of the weapons, which adds a huge amount of variety and replay value to the game if you're willing to put in the time and effort to get them all. Once you defeat the first boss, you get access to a second shop, where you can buy special items, weapons, and outfits related to each defeated boss's abilities, like the hammer and this suit of armor. The thing is, you can only buy one reward from each boss per run, and like everything in the shop, they are expensive. It can be difficult to know what to spend your hard-earned tooth wheels on when staying alive is usually a much more pressing matter. Some of them are worth it, others probably aren't, depending on your playstyle. Most are better left for a New Game Plus run once you know what you're doing and don't have to suffer through the early game grind again. The same is true of the modifications you can purchase from the second shop too. Each of them give Alisa a clockwork upgrade at the cost of her humanity. There are 6 in total, 5 available from the get-go, and 1 extra that must be found out in the dollhouse. Some of them are significant upgrades, like the magnetic fingertips, which not only attract tooth wheels from further away, very useful when they leap out of bounds if you down a doll too close to a wall, but gives you auto-aim too, which is such a big help in this game I'd almost call it a necessary purchase. The skin liqueur, which increases Alisa's defense, is another one that's worth buying as soon as possible, but the others like the gear implants, which allow you to run while carrying heavy things, are more dependent on your playstyle, or if you're in the game for the fashion rather than the frights. Like everything, they're expensive, but in this case it makes sense. You're giving up a part of yourself. It's not a decision to be made lightly no matter what part of you is being upgraded. It's a really cool mechanic, and it ties into the game's body horror really well. I do wish that the modifications were represented on Alisa's character model more. The only one I noticed were these wrist blades, but I understand there's already enough costumes, and making different modified variants for every single one of them would just be too much work. Either way, I think you're better off leaving them alone until you've seen the first ending. The last thing to talk about in terms of gameplay are the bosses, and unfortunately here Alisa puts its worst foot forward. The bosses suffer from all the same problems as the regular enemies, in that they can be so fast, hit so hard, and stun lock you so early in the fight that they can kill you before you get a proper sense of their abilities, especially the first one. All the other bosses can be an intimidating challenge at first, but there are ways to make them easier. Complete an extra quest and you'll get an AI helper for the next boss you fight. Arrive at the arena with the right equipment, and they'll fight you with fewer attacks. One of them is a straight up on-rails gimmick fight that can become effortless once you learn the boss's attack patterns. Even the final boss is made slightly easier by virtue of the fact by the end of the game, you'll definitely have access to Alisa's most powerful weapons. The first boss has none of those mitigating factors, and you can stumble right into him well before you're ready for the fight. My only advice is to hoard handgun ammo, and try to position yourself between the hammers and the gloves. There is a sweet spot you can find where the machine will almost never hit you. Once the machine breaks down, this fight should be a cakewalk, especially if you've been relying on the saber. Now you should have everything you need to escape the dollhouse and uncover its secrets. All that's left to talk about is the story. Everything else is spoiler territory, so if you want to avoid them, go to here. Boy, are they in for a surprise. Alisa isn't the only one trapped in the dollhouse. Alvarez, the spy who stole the Empire's blueprints, is just as stuck as she is, and just as intent on escape. That might not be an option for Elise anymore now that she's a doll herself, but she's willing to help Alisa in exchange for a new leg. Exploring the dollhouse, you'll find notes that reveal the building was once some kind of asylum that received a gift called the Finger of God from the Manor of Tides. People who came into contact with it came away horribly burned, if they were lucky. People who spent time in its presence were changed, driven mad, or twisted into inorganic monstrosities. Two of the asylum's staff, Pierre Edmiston and Isabella Flora, began experimenting with the Finger of God on patients in an attempt to cure death. Isabella Flora turned herself and the asylum's garden to steel. One patient, Edith, turned to glass and took over the basement. Another grew into something else entirely before they disappeared into the walls. Edmiston's own attempts failed, but while he couldn't cure death, he could reverse it with the invention of his tooth wheels. And after a while, the method became more important to him than the outcome, assuming it was even still him pulling his own strings by that point. As you progress deeper into the game and unlock more of the dollhouse, you learn escape is a little bit harder than just opening the front door and walking back out into the woods. At some point, the asylum was swallowed by a sinkhole and buried underground. That weird little gazebo thing seen in the prologue, that's actually the very top of the building and your only method of escape. Anyone unfortunate enough to venture too close gets grabbed by one of the guard dolls, which is how Alisa and Alvarez ended up stuck in the dollhouse together. By this point, Elise will be gone, either dead or taken by her mother, but Alvarez is still up and fighting, only he no longer wants to escape. The Finger of God has got to him, and he considers himself the dollhouse's new king.
I am literally invincible.
A few shots from this gun horse relieves him of that delusion. Alvarez dies, but not before telling Alisa of his plan to build a bomb in order to destroy the Finger of God and escape before the thing got its claws into him. Alisa completes the bomb, but before she can set it off, she's confronted by the true king of the dollhouse, the Doll Master.
Huh? Paul?
That patient who was twisted by the Finger of God and disappeared into the walls. Paul wasn't just operating the shop as a means to help Alisa out. The more tooth wheels you give him, the more powerful the Doll Master becomes. I always knew Paul was a piece of shit. Kill him, and that's it. The ending you get depends on how many modifications Alisa's installed. None, and she'll escape. The dollhouse is destroyed, and she learns the horrible truth behind the Emperor's blueprints. One or more modifications, and all that clockwork will hold Alisa back long enough for the guard dolls to grab her. The Dollmaster is still killed, but the dollhouse survives, and Alisa within it, now trapped as one of its playthings, until some spasm of the earth thrusts the dollhouse onto the surface, and Alisa is able to escape into the wild, pursued by Jean-Francois. Install every modification and you'll get the third, and what I sincerely hope is the canon ending. Instead of escaping, Alisa chooses to shove the bomb down the Dollmaster's throat and rule the dollhouse as its new queen. If Alisa's alive, she'll even be there to present Alisa with her crown. If not, Alisa will take up the mantle herself. Needless to say, Alisa leaves you with a lot of unanswered questions. The central conflict of escaping the dollhouse might be resolved, but that's about it. Very little is revealed about the Finger of God, or the Manor of Tides, or even the world at large, which is a shame because as far as fantasy steampunk settings go, it's really cool from what is there. It's heavily implied that the setup of Alvarez as a spy who stole some vital blueprints was just that, a setup to lure Alisa into the dollhouse, perhaps for the purpose of opening up access to the Finger of God for the Empire. Not even a setup that Alvarez is in on either. He still might be a spy, but it's heavily implied someone wanted Alisa to find this place. A note left by Elise if you don't help her claims Alisa is immune to the Finger of God's effects, like she herself used to be, which might be why the Empire would send her in to find it for them, and also why Elisa's mother hunts you throughout the game. That said, Alisa does seem to go a little loopy as the game goes on. Jean-Francois outright states in one ending that he faked his trip in the prologue, and in another seems very aware of the monstrosities possibly waiting for him in the dollhouse. You're telling me this man, who looks looks like a wax figure who stepped right out of Madame Tussauds, isn't somehow related to the dollhouse? Beyond the Empire's interests in the Finger of God, diaries scattered around the garden reveal the dollhouse was discovered by a group of miners at some point before the events of the game, who were told specifically to dig in the area by their employers. Alisa might not have heard of the dollhouse before getting dragged down into its depths, but other parties certainly have, and they want whatever secrets it possesses. You even visit Alisa's father in the prologue if this bit of flavor text is to be believed, but his connection to everything is never made clear. He's the only resident left in town and claims everyone moved away to the big cities, but it's heavily implied everyone who lived there is now a doll in the Master's collection, which might explain why the guy has so many locks on his front door. I don't know if Casper Croes has answers to any of these questions, but they make for a compelling hook for any potential sequels, especially now that the dollhouse has been blown open and the residents are running wild in two of the endings. There's a huge amount of room to expand the setting and the story, and I'll be curious to see what, if anything, Casper Croes does with it. But for now we'll just have to content ourselves with New Game Plus. You keep all your weapons, outfits and modifications, but lose all your items and tooth wheels, plus enemies get a little tankier with each cycle. To offset that, you get access to the Devil's Roulette Wheel. Dare you spin to win? You can get some great stuff from this thing too, like the black nurse dress that restores health when you deal out melee damage. The ridiculous price is more than worth it. Aside from that, you get the chance to open up areas of the dollhouse you couldn't previously, thanks to needing a boss reward to unlock the doors. There's a bunch of fun extras to try out too, if you can find them. Mostly it just feels good to go through the game again with enough power to curb stomp everything in your way. It's well worth at least one extra playthrough, at least to see another one of the endings, and catch all of the game's cool little hidden details. Needless to say, as a fan of retro survival horror games, I really enjoyed Alisa, but it's not without its problems. In a couple of ways it's a little too authentic to the genre. I've already spoken about how to overcome the very steep difficulty curve, and that harsh pacing is where my biggest criticism with the game lies. It feels like Alisa started out as a much larger, more ambitious project, and then was cut down partway through development once it became apparent just how big the original idea was going to be. That the game has so many enemy types is impressive, but it throws them all at you way too quickly. The dolls that function as your standard zombie appear for 2 rooms, and then are mostly just gone for the rest of the game. In the second room of the funhouse, you're hit with big heads, these little tricycle ghosts, and a cymbal monkey, all in quick succession. These tin soldiers appear as you progress throughout the story, but never feel like they belong, as though they were originally meant for an area that got the chop. Yet, once you reach the basement, this problem goes away pretty much instantly. The flooded area and the garden both introduce far fewer enemy types, and all of them feel like they get their chance to shine. I don't think the game has too many enemies, but maybe some of them should have been saved for New Game Plus runs, like the cymbal monkeys or tricycle ghosts. If only to give the standard dolls and clowns, frustrating as the latter can be, their time in the spotlight. As it is, it feels front-loaded with way too many mini-bosses. The enemy variety isn't the only part of the game that feels chafed by cut content either. The story starts out front and center, but just fades into the background as you progress. Alvarez goes on his own adventure through the dollhouse, but you barely interact with him and you never get a sense of his journey. Elise is set up as a major player in the story, and Alisa's only major ally, but then just vanishes halfway through the game if you follow her questline. Jean-Francois has an in-game model but disappears after the prologue. None of the area bosses are given much attention despite their memorable personalities. You're never even given the chance to fight Alisa's mother in a proper boss fight. It feels like your choices were originally meant to have an impact on the story, like they do in Resident Evil, but it was mostly cut for time, and what remains is just the little bit that was completed before the mechanic was shelved. Similarly, you're able to complete the garden and the basement in any order you wish, which is really cool, but there is an objective right way to do it, so there's really no choice at all. Overall, these weren't huge problems for me, but they did stick out. Otherwise, my criticisms are all nitpicks. If you've watched my Men in Black video,
which YouTube probably won't have, since at the time of this video uploading, half the game footage from the cursed object that is my Men in Black critique has been lost in a hard drive death.
You know I'm not a fan of retro survival horror with a focus on melee combat. I think the boss weapons could definitely use a damage buff, and it would be cool if the cosmetic modification allowed you to change into any of the outfits you owned instead of its own bonus pool, so you could use the buff of one costume while rocking the look of another. I also don't think auto-aim should have been locked behind a modification, but you can get through the game easily enough without it. There are still a couple of bugs rattling around too, the game freezing when selecting the keyring, and the first boss hitting Alisa in such a way to make her lock up were the main couple I experienced while playing, but I didn't get any footage of them. There is one section of the game though that deserves its own brief portion of the video, and it's this late game area that presents you with a short gauntlet where you have to sneak past a pair of powerful enemies. It's so short that I can't honestly say that it's bad, but it is definitely janky and can be very frustrating your first time through. The gun horses can spot you very easily, and it can be hard to tell where they are thanks to the camera angles only rarely providing a decent view of the area. Once you know the route through the section, it's easy. It'll never be a problem again, but that's only because it's so short. In fact, its brevity is its one saving grace. It's an interesting experiment and it shakes up the gameplay for a couple of minutes, but in my experience, stealth in a title with fixed camera angles is a real tough road to travel. It's definitely not horrendous, but it does stick out. Alisa might be overstuffed in some ways and undercooked in others, but in no way does it feel unfinished. Casper Croes has been dropping bug fixes and updates every few months ever since the game's release, and it recently received its final major update, so there's never been a better time to jump in and check it out. If you played it at release and haven't gone back to it since, the developer's cut update makes Alisa more than worth a second chance. Alisa took me back to a time in gaming history and a time in my own life that I have a lot of nostalgia for. It might have its problems, but its crunchy 240p graphics and pixelated pre-rendered backgrounds give it an authenticity to the survival horror style that other modern throwbacks can't match, in my opinion. It proves there is still a place in gaming for this style of sincere retro survival horror, as opposed to the more self-conscious throwbacks like the works of Puppet Combo or Harry Partridge's pitch-perfect parody Ghostbleed. There are some ideas that can only be expressed at their best in this style, and it's why I think it would be great to see more games like Alisa in the future. Whether or not we get any, Alisa is still a great time. It's short, it's sweet, it's fun, it's creepy, it is a love letter to fans of survival horror, no strings attached. Thanks for watching.